I never thought a single sentence could silence an entire room. But then it happened. My wife's voice cut through the warm hum of the holiday chatter like a jagged knife. "I'm done. I want a divorce." For a moment, the twinkle of Christmas lights felt cruel, like tiny stars mocking my collapse. I froze, caught somewhere between disbelief and a nausea that seemed to rise from my chest and settle heavy in my gut. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles became a blur, a surreal haze that made the laughter around me sound distorted, almost underwater. They laughed. My in-laws. My once trusted family. The kind faces I had tried so hard to impress over the years now twisted into mockery. Their laughter wasn't quiet, it wasn't polite. It was deliberate, sharp, as if every chuckle was a hammer driving me deeper into humiliation. And my wife? She smiled that practiced, detached smile she had perfected over the years, the one that always made me feel like I was standing on the wrong side of a line I didn't even know existed. Finally, my father-in-law said, voice dripping with satisfaction, "About time you realized it." I wanted to respond. I wanted to defend myself, to shout, to demand what had gone wrong, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth felt like sandpaper, my throat like a canyon too wide to bridge. So I stayed silent, my thoughts turning over every memory I had of her, of us, of everything I thought we shared. Every argument I thought I had won suddenly seemed meaningless, every compromise a trap. I remember staring at the reflection of the Christmas tree in the window, the lights fractured into 1,000 distorted points. It was beautiful in a cruel sort of way. I wanted to tell myself this was temporary, that we would laugh this off tomorrow, that it was just the stress of the holidays. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a phase. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a verdict. And I was guilty of loving too much and seeing too little. The table went quiet for a fraction of a second before the laughter resumed. My mother-in-law's high-pitched cackle cut through the tension, and I felt something inside me snap. Not anger, not exactly. Something colder, something that had been buried under years of trying to be the perfect husband, the perfect son-in-law, the perfect man. It was humiliation, yes, but it was also clarity. For the first time in years, I saw myself as they saw me, a man whose worth was measured in convenience and performance, not in who he truly was. I let the moment stretch, letting their laughter wash over me while I retreated inward. My mind raced, scanning every failure, every misstep. Had I ignored the warning signs? Had I been so focused on work, on appearances, on keeping everyone else happy, that I didn't notice the cracks forming beneath my own roof? The realization was bitter, but it was also honest. And honesty, I decided, was the only thing left that could save me from being completely hollow. The waiter appeared then, quietly setting down the last of the drinks. He glanced at my wife, then at me. There was nothing judgmental in his eyes, only a subtle recognition, as if he understood without knowing the story. That brief, imperceptible acknowledgement felt like a lifeline tossed to a drowning man. For a moment, I almost smiled, almost dared to imagine that not everything in the room was against me. I remember how the air felt, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My in-laws didn't notice the subtle shift, or maybe they did and ignored it. I couldn't care less. The warmth of the room had vanished, replaced by a stark, fluorescent clarity. I saw their faces in sharp relief now, the arrogance, the smug satisfaction, the sheer certainty that I had no recourse, no defense, no chance to reclaim what I had lost. And yet, amid all the chaos, a thought struck me, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of defiance. They may have laughed, they may have celebrated the collapse of my marriage like a victory, but the truth remained, my life didn't end here. It hadn't. Something inside me, quiet and stubborn, whispered that this humiliation, this fracture, this moment where everything I had built seemed to crumble, was only the beginning. I wanted to say something, anything, but instead I let the silence stretch. Silence has weight, I realized. Silence allows people to see themselves more clearly, allows them to sit with the truth of their actions. And maybe, just maybe, silence can be more powerful than any shouting match. The evening dragged on. Conversation continued around me, hollow and meaningless. I caught glimpses of my wife talking animatedly to her friends, laughing as if nothing had changed. I felt a sharp pang of anger, but I let it pass, letting it dissolve into a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. I didn't belong in their world anymore, I realized, and perhaps I had never really belonged. But I did belong somewhere. I just didn't know where yet. When the last dish was cleared, and the lights flickered softly against the walls, I made my exit. No dramatic farewell. No confrontation. Just a quiet retreat, a man moving through the cold night air with only his thoughts for company. I walked to the car, feeling the chill seep into my bones, feeling it strip away the remnants of the man who had thought he could survive by pleasing everyone else. And then I thought of the waiter again, the quiet observer who had seen more in a glance than anyone else in the room. There was a story there, I realized. A story that I didn't yet understand, but one that felt important, like a signal or a guidepost. Maybe he was a messenger, maybe he was a mirror, or maybe he was nothing at all. But something about that brief, almost imperceptible interaction stayed with me as I sat behind the wheel, staring at the dark street and the glimmering Christmas lights that no longer brought warmth, only reflection. I started the engine. The car hummed beneath me, a quiet promise of movement, of departure, of escape. And as the cold night wrapped around me, I made a decision, though I didn't yet know the consequences. I would not let this shattering define me. Not entirely. I would find a way to rise, to reclaim something that felt more like me than anything they could ever laugh at or belittle. For now I drove. Through the silence, through the frost, through the echo of that cruel laughter. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the hurt, beneath the humiliation, beneath the fear, a faint, stubborn ember glowed. This was only the beginning. The night after the Christmas disaster, I drove through streets blanketed in frost, the cold air pressing against my face like a reminder that I was still breathing, still alive, still painfully alone. Every turn of the wheel felt heavier than the last, each passing streetlight exposing the emptiness that had replaced the warmth of home. My mind refused to settle. It ricocheted between memories, regrets, and the constant, gnawing question, how had it come to this? I parked in an empty lot and sat behind the wheel, letting the engine hum beneath me. The silence inside the car was different from the house, different from the laughter I had endured. It was heavy, yes, but it was mine. For the first time in hours, maybe days, I could think without interruption. I pulled my hands from the steering wheel and rubbed my eyes, trying to rid myself of the sting of tears I refused to acknowledge. I remembered the fights we had, the small cracks that had grown too wide to ignore. The missed anniversaries, the overlooked feelings, the silent resentment that had built like layers of dust in the corners of our life. It wasn't just her leaving. It was the years I had spent pretending everything was fine while the foundation crumbled beneath me. I felt both betrayed and complicit. I had let it happen. The glow of a street lamp caught a crumpled business card in my pocket, the one I had received from a colleague just hours before, inviting me to take on a project that was both a risk and a chance at redemption. I stared at it, weighing the opportunity against the paralyzing fear that I wasn't enough, that I'd fail spectacularly, and that failure would confirm everything they had already said without words. The decision felt impossible, yet strangely necessary. I realized that while my marriage had ended, my life didn't have to stop. There were paths still open, choices I had ignored while wrapped up in the expectations of others. For the first time in years, I could act purely for myself, without trying to fit into a mold that had never truly been mine. A soft knock on the car window startled me. A stranger, a passerby, merely smiled and walked on, leaving me with an inexplicable sense of connection. It reminded me of the waiter from last night, the quiet observer who had seen more than anyone else in the room. Maybe there was a message in these fleeting encounters, that life, even at its most humiliating and lonely, held moments of clarity if I chose to see them. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but even that felt impossible. I wasn't ready to talk, not yet. Words would betray me. Silence, in contrast, gave me space to think, to plan, to let the ember of determination grow. I imagined the days ahead, the project, the work, the chance to prove to myself that I was capable of more than they had ever given me credit for. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had lost all sense of time. The frost began to bite, but I barely noticed. I leaned back in my seat, hands clasped over my stomach, and allowed myself to feel the depth of the loss without letting it paralyze me. There was sorrow, yes, but also a strange liberation. The world had ended in one corner of my life, but a new one was quietly beginning. I drove home at dawn, the streets empty, the air crisp. The city was waking, but I felt ahead of it somehow, alert in a way I hadn't been in years. Each red light, each empty intersection, each distant sound of morning traffic was a reminder. I was still in motion. I was still present. I could choose the next step, and for the first time in months, I wanted to. When I finally entered my apartment, the familiar walls no longer felt like confinement. I poured myself a coffee, the steam rising between us, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a life not defined by failure or abandonment, but by choice and intent. There was fear, certainly, but fear felt lighter when paired with determination. It became a companion rather than a jailer. I pulled out my laptop and opened the email from my colleague again, reading the proposal with new eyes. The work would demand everything, but it would also give me something I hadn't had in years: control. It was an opportunity to rebuild, brick by brick, not just professionally but emotionally. My mind swirled with possibilities, the weight of last night's humiliation slowly giving way to cautious hope. Late in the afternoon, I found myself wandering the city streets again, just to feel the world moving beneath me. The cold cut through my jacket, sharp and honest, reminding me that nothing here was soft, nothing promised. And yet, in that honesty, there was clarity. I was alone, yes, but I was awake. I was aware. I was responsible for the next move. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memory of laughter still haunted me, but it no longer had the same power. I thought of the waiter again, the brief acknowledgement, and the card that had landed in my hand without explanation. I realized that sometimes, salvation comes not from grand gestures, but from quiet recognition. Someone else had seen the value in me when I couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, I could begin to see it myself. Sleep came finally, hesitant and light, like a tentative friend. Tomorrow would be the first real test, choosing to act, to take the project, to step into a world that had shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't ready to call it victory. I wasn't ready to feel whole. But I was ready to move. And that, I decided, was enough for now. This was only the beginning of the path forward. I didn't expect anyone to notice me that night. I had convinced myself that after the Christmas humiliation, I was invisible, a ghost drifting through a world that had stopped caring. Yet there he was, the waiter. Quiet, steady, observing with eyes that seemed to understand more than words could ever convey. There was no judgment, only a subtle acknowledgement of my existence in a world that had made me feel disposable. I sat alone at the far corner of the bar, nursing a drink I didn't taste, staring at the condensation sliding down the glass like the seconds of my life I had spent ignoring the truth about my marriage. The warmth of the bar was almost mocking, a comfort I couldn't accept. And then the waiter appeared beside me, not intrusively, not with pity, but with a presence that demanded recognition. "You look like you could use someone to see you," he said quietly, setting a clean glass in front of me. His words were simple, but they cut through the fog that had enveloped my mind. I looked up, unsure if I was meant to respond, and found in his gaze neither curiosity nor sympathy, just understanding. I wanted to tell him my story, to unburden myself of the embarrassment, the anger, and the hollow ache of loss. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let my silence speak for me, and he didn't rush to fill it. There was patience in him, a rhythm to his presence that felt like a counterbalance to the chaos in my life. I thought about the divorce, about the laughter that had pierced me like glass, about the in-laws who had made me feel less than human, about my wife, who had smiled as if the destruction she left behind was inconsequential. And yet, here was someone who seemed to see me, the broken pieces and all, without flinching or turning away. He slid a card across the counter. Small, unremarkable, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, and felt a flicker of curiosity stir in the emptiness I had carried for days. There was nothing written on it, no explanation, no instructions, just a presence that suggested opportunity, that whispered possibility. "You'll figure it out," the waiter said, stepping back into the shadows of the bar. "Some losses feel permanent, until someone notices what's really valuable." I held the card tightly, the edges pressing into my palm. It was an odd feeling, a combination of confusion and clarity. I didn't understand why he had given it to me or what it meant, but I felt, for the first time since my marriage ended, a spark that wasn't entirely fear or regret. Perhaps it was hope, or the first hint of determination to reclaim something I had lost long before that night. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The bar emptied slowly, leaving me alone with the card, the lingering scent of whiskey and polished wood, and the echo of his words. I kept thinking about them, about what he meant by, "What's really valuable?" Was it money? Was it opportunity? Or was it something subtler, more personal, something I had buried under years of trying to be everything for everyone else? I left the bar that night with the card in my pocket and a new weight in my chest. Not a burden, but a responsibility, a reminder that there were paths still available, even if I couldn't see them yet. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching shadows that felt like both a warning and an invitation. I was walking a line between the life I had lost and the one I could still claim, and the waiter had, somehow, illuminated it without a single grand gesture. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I traced the edges of the card, wondering if the answer would come to me in time, or if I had to chase it down. The spark in my chest refused to die, and with it, the first inklings of a plan began to form. Maybe it wasn't about revenge. Maybe it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. Maybe it was about noticing what I had overlooked all along: my own worth, my own strength, my own capacity to rise from humiliation and despair. I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, imagining the days ahead. The card, the waiter, the quiet understanding, it was all a signal. Something had shifted, imperceptibly, in the trajectory of my life. The silence of the night felt less like isolation and more like preparation. A preparation for decisions I would have to make, for risks I would have to take, and for the man I needed to become. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I carried with me a single thought, stubborn and defiant: I was not finished. Not yet. The world may have laughed, may have dismissed me, may have tried to erase me, but someone had seen me. And if someone else could see what I was worth, perhaps it was finally time I saw it too. Tomorrow, I decided I would start moving. Not recklessly, not with anger, but deliberately. One step, one decision, one choice at a time. The waiter had opened a door, and it was up to me whether I would walk through it. This was only the beginning of understanding what I had truly lost, and what I still had the chance to reclaim. The morning sunlight felt alien as it streamed through the blinds, cutting lines across the floor that seemed sharper than the edges of my own thoughts. I had slept little, if at all, wrestling with the conversation at the bar and the mysterious card that now rested on my kitchen table. And yet, when my phone buzzed with an email from a colleague offering a high-stakes project, I felt a strange clarity. This was the first real opportunity to step out from the shadow of last night's humiliation. I read the email several times, each word punctuating the responsibility and risk the project entailed. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a proving ground. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt that flicker of ambition stir in my chest. Not the hollow ambition that had defined me before, always tied to appearances or validation, but something deeper, more personal. A need to reclaim myself, to measure my worth by my own standards rather than the approval of others. I started the morning routine with mechanical precision, pouring coffee, checking messages, and staring out the window at a city that seemed indifferent to my private turmoil. The streets buzzed with life, oblivious to the collapse I had endured. And maybe that was a kind of solace. Life continued, relentless and unyielding, and perhaps so could I. I arrived at the office with a tight knot in my stomach, but also a strange determination. My colleagues greeted me with the usual mix of curiosity and skepticism, though I noticed something different in their eyes: A hint of surprise, perhaps that I had not crumbled entirely under the weight of personal failure. Their words were clipped, professional, but I could sense the undercurrent of doubt, and it fueled me in an unexpected way. The project was demanding from the start. Decisions had to be made quickly, strategies devised with precision, and every action carried consequences. I felt the familiar pressure of responsibility, the adrenaline that had once been exhilarating and now felt like a lifeline. Each problem I solved, each calculation I completed, reminded me that I was capable, that I had not been broken entirely by the events of Christmas. And yet, as the hours passed, the memory of my wife and the laughter of my in-laws lingered like ghosts in the back of my mind. They had tried to define me in a single night, to reduce my existence to humiliation, and part of me wondered if I would ever truly escape that shadow. But the work demanded focus, and in focusing, I discovered a paradoxical freedom. I could not change the past, but I could shape the present. Lunch came and went unnoticed, a blur of emails and conference calls. And then a colleague approached, skepticism softened by genuine interest. "I wasn't sure you'd take this on after everything," he said, pausing. "But you're doing more than anyone expected." I felt a twinge of pride, mingled with a bitter awareness that the validation was still external. My mind wandered briefly to the card from the waiter, the cryptic suggestion that someone had seen value in me when no one else did. Maybe it was time I started seeing it too, not through the eyes of others, but my own. The afternoon brought setbacks, unexpected client demands, last-minute revisions, and logistical nightmares. Each challenge was a test, a reminder that success was never easy, and that my strength was measured not in comfort, but in resilience. I began to notice a shift within myself, patience where there had been frustration, clarity where there had been confusion, a subtle but unmistakable determination to persevere. By evening, the project had reached a critical juncture. Decisions I made now would have immediate impact, and the weight of responsibility pressed against my chest. I realized that this was more than just work. It was a crucible. And for the first time, I felt ready to step into it fully, without hesitation, without fear that my past defined me. I left the office later, the city alive with evening lights, and for the first time in days, I walked without the heavy weight of humiliation pressing on my shoulders. The night air was cold but honest, and I breathed it in deeply, letting it fill the spaces that had been empty since Christmas. I thought again of the waiter, of the card, of the quiet recognition that had sparked something I hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. At home, I poured a glass of whiskey, not for comfort, but as a quiet companion to reflection. I reviewed the day in my mind, noting each decision, each small success, each moment where I had chosen to act rather than retreat. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a sense of accountability, a promise to myself that I would continue moving forward, step by deliberate step. As I finally sat down to rest, the flickering lights of the city beyond my window mirrored the flicker of determination inside me. I didn't yet know where this path would lead, or what obstacles awaited, but I had taken the first conscious step toward reclaiming my life. The humiliation of Christmas still lingered, but it no longer defined me. I was beginning to see a life shaped not by the judgments of others, but by my own choices, my own resilience, my own vision. And in that quiet resolve, I understood, this was the crossroads. One path led to retreat, stagnation, and endless regret. The other, uncertain and challenging, promised growth, empowerment, and a chance to rise above the ruins. I chose the latter. Tomorrow, the work would continue, the challenges would intensify, but I was no longer the man who had sat frozen in that holiday dining room. I was moving, and that movement carried with it the first real sense of hope in weeks. This was only the beginning of reclaiming not just my career, but myself. The first real victory came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact was thunderous in my chest. Weeks of work, long nights, and decisions that had once seemed terrifying began to coalesce into something tangible, something I could touch and feel. My project, the one I had hesitated to take after Christmas, was gaining recognition. Not loud applause, not grand gestures, but subtle acknowledgement that carried far more weight than anything my in-laws or my wife had ever offered. I walked into the office that morning with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. The emails were there first, short notes of appreciation from colleagues who had previously doubted my commitment or competence. Each message was a small affirmation, a reminder that my worth wasn't defined by humiliation but by action, skill, and resilience. I smiled, a private, quiet smile that felt almost sacred. The meetings that day were tense, demanding, yet exhilarating. Every challenge thrown my way became a chance to prove myself, not to anyone else, but to myself. I found a rhythm, a focus I hadn't felt in years, and with it, a sense of momentum that lifted the weight of failure from my shoulders. I realized that success wasn't about avoiding mistakes, it was about navigating them with clarity and purpose. At lunch, a colleague approached, hesitating before speaking. "I wasn't sure you'd handle this," he said, voice softer than I expected. "But you're doing better than anyone thought possible." I nodded, acknowledging the compliment without vanity. The validation was external, yes, but it confirmed something I had begun to sense within myself. I was capable, even after being broken. And yet, even amid this quiet triumph, memories of Christmas lingered. I recalled the laughter, the derision, the sense that my life had been dismissed in a single evening. But the sting of humiliation had dulled. It no longer dictated my emotional state. I could recall it, analyze it, and learn from it, rather than be consumed by it. My focus had shifted from what I had lost to what I could still achieve. That evening, after the final meeting of the day, I found myself standing alone in the office, staring at the skyline through the window. The city lights twinkled with indifference, yet I felt connected to them in a way I hadn't before. They were witnesses, silent and impartial, to my reclamation. For the first time, I allowed myself a private celebration, a quiet acknowledgement that I had risen, however slightly, from the wreckage. The card from the waiter resurfaced in my mind, its cryptic weight pressing gently in my pocket. Perhaps he had known, somehow, that I was capable of more than I realized. Perhaps it wasn't just chance that had placed that small, weighty rectangle in my hand. It was a reminder that recognition, however small or mysterious, can ignite a fire that transforms hesitation into action. At home, I reviewed the day in detail. Every decision, every minor victory, every moment I had chosen focus over despair became a thread in a tapestry of progress. I realized that my self-worth wasn't contingent on the approval of those who had mocked me, nor on the past that had betrayed me. It was built from the choices I made, the risks I accepted, and the relentless pursuit of purpose. That night, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The first victory was not monumental, not celebrated with fanfare or visible accolades. But it mattered. It proved to me that I could act decisively, even in the face of personal ruin, and that small triumphs could accumulate into something meaningful. I began to sense a pattern, a rhythm of growth that would carry me beyond the shadows of Christmas and the empty laughter of those who sought to diminish me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I understood something profound. Empowerment comes quietly. It comes not with vindication shouted at the world, but with recognition of your own value and the courage to act upon it. I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Relief that I had survived, and anticipation for the challenges ahead, knowing that each one was now a chance to reaffirm my strength. Tomorrow, the work would continue. New obstacles would arise, doubts would return, and I would face moments that tested not just my skill but my resolve. But the first victory had planted a seed that promised growth, that whispered possibilities, and that reminded me that even in the aftermath of humiliation, progress was possible. And as I drifted into sleep, the ember of determination burned a little brighter. This was only the beginning of building not just my career, but a life that I could claim entirely for myself. I never imagined I would see them again so soon. Yet there they were, my ex-wife and her parents, at a gathering I hadn't anticipated, in a place I had thought would feel safe. The air was thick with expectation, every laugh, every glance, every gesture carrying a weight I could not ignore. And yet, I noticed something different this time. I was no longer the man crushed by humiliation. I was a man who had survived, who had begun to reclaim himself, who had tasted victory and understood the value of his own strength. My ex-wife's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of surprise or perhaps curiosity. She had expected to see defeat, and instead, she saw composure, a quiet certainty that startled her. Her smile, once so disarming, now seemed brittle, forced, lacking the power it once had over me. My in-laws' laughter, the cruel chorus that had once pierced me, was now met with calm observation. I was no longer trembling under their gaze. The waiter's card came to mind, a small, cryptic gesture that had sparked a realization I could not have achieved alone. It reminded me that recognition, subtle or unexplained, can awaken a strength that is otherwise dormant. That strength was now present, steady beneath my ribs, ready to meet whatever the night would bring. I navigated the gathering with measured steps, feeling each interaction as both challenge and opportunity. Conversations passed around me, polite yet tinged with the usual undertone of judgment. I smiled when necessary, nodded when appropriate, but I no longer sought approval. Each acknowledgement I offered was genuine, not a concession to their perception of me. Then came the confrontation I had anticipated, though not with hostility. My ex-wife approached, her eyes wary, searching for cracks that no longer existed. "I didn't expect to see you like this," she said softly, almost a whisper. I studied her expression, noting the uncertainty behind her practiced demeanor. I met her gaze calmly. "I didn't expect to see myself like this either," I replied, my voice even, confident. "But I'm finally seeing clearly." The words hung between us, not in accusation, but in acknowledgement. I had nothing to prove to her or to her family anymore. The humiliation they had wielded so effortlessly had lost its power. I had confronted it within myself, and in doing so, I reclaimed control over the narrative of my life. My in-laws, sensing the shift, faltered. Their smiles were tighter, their gestures more calculated. I could feel their unease, though I paid it no mind. I was no longer subject to their laughter or their approval. I was, for the first time in years, fully present in my own reality. A subtle moment of acknowledgement passed between me and the waiter, who had coincidentally appeared at the gathering. His presence, quiet and unobtrusive, was a reminder of the journey I had undertaken, the small gestures that had awakened something essential within me. The card, the conversation, the recognition of potential that I had overlooked all served as markers along this path of self-reclamation. The rest of the evening unfolded with an almost surreal calm. Conversations flowed, but I moved through them with a sense of detachment, observing rather than reacting, participating without surrendering my newfound inner authority. Each interaction reinforced the realization that my self-worth was no longer tied to their judgment. When I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to feel the liberation of having confronted the past without losing myself in the process. The laughter and mockery of Christmas night felt distant, like echoes in a canyon I had already left behind. The encounter with my ex-wife and her family was not victory in the conventional sense, it was something deeper. It was proof that I could exist, unshaken, in the presence of those who had sought to diminish me. I walked to the car, the night air crisp against my skin, and for the first time, I felt a strange combination of closure and anticipation. Closure because I had met the ghosts of my past with composure and clarity. Anticipation because the journey was not over. There were still challenges to face, still victories to claim, still opportunities to define the man I wanted to be. And in that quiet, almost sacred moment, I understood. Confronting the past is not about retaliation or proving others wrong. It's about recognizing your own strength, reclaiming your narrative, and stepping forward unburdened by those who doubted you. The past may shape you, but it does not have to define you. Tomorrow, the path would continue, the stakes would rise, but I would walk it with confidence, tempered by experience and guided by the quiet power of knowing my own worth. This was only the beginning of standing fully in my own light. The day arrived with an almost unbearable weight, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. Months of struggle, humiliation, small victories, and quiet self-discovery had led to this point. Every choice I had made, every risk I had taken, had brought me to the edge of a precipice where the stakes were higher than ever. And for the first time, I understood that the life I wanted was entirely dependent on the courage I could summon in this moment. I stood in the office, staring at the final proposal that could define my career, my reputation, and, in some ways, the man I had become. The numbers, the strategy, the client's expectations, they all pressed against me, demanding perfection. But perfection had never been the goal. This was about authenticity, about acting with conviction, about trusting in the preparation, effort, and resilience that had carried me this far. The team looked to me with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. They didn't know it, but they were witnesses to something deeper than a business decision. They were watching a man confront the sum of his fears and past humiliations and choose to rise. I drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like armor rather than a burden. The presentation began, each slide, each word carefully chosen to convey not just data, but vision, intent, and unwavering focus. My voice was steady, deliberate, but beneath it, a pulse of raw emotion drove me forward. The memory of the laughter, the mockery, the doubt I had carried like a shadow for months. Each question from the client, each challenge from my colleagues, was met with clarity and poise. I realized that confidence isn't born from being unafraid, it's born from acknowledging fear and proceeding anyway. Halfway through, a critical question arose, one that could unravel everything I had built. The client's tone was sharp, probing, testing the limits of my composure. For a moment, my heart thudded painfully, and I felt the old self creeping back, whispering that I might fail spectacularly. But I remembered the waiter, the card, the quiet lessons of subtle recognition and belief. I remembered my first victory, the steps I had taken to reclaim myself, the confrontations I had endured without surrendering to fear. I answered with calm authority, each word measured, each point reinforced by data and vision. The tension in the room shifted imperceptibly, the doubt giving way to cautious respect. And in that moment, I understood something essential. The greatest triumph isn't in avoiding challenge, it's in facing it fully, unflinching, and choosing action over retreat. By the end of the presentation, the room felt charged, the air thick with the satisfaction of accomplishment. The client leaned back, eyes thoughtful, and finally, a nod of approval. It was subtle, almost understated, but it carried weight greater than any applause. This was validation of effort, yes, but more importantly, it was proof that I could stand in my own power, even when everything else suggested I could not. After the meeting, my team congratulated me quietly, sensing something profound in the day's outcome. I allowed a small, private smile, knowing that my triumph was not just professional, it was deeply personal. I had faced my fears, confronted the remnants of humiliation, and emerged not just intact, but strengthened. Walking back to my office alone, I felt the cool hum of the city outside, the lights stretching like silent witnesses to the journey I had undertaken. The shadows of past failures still lingered, but they no longer had authority over me. I had chosen decisively, acted boldly, and trusted in my own ability to navigate uncertainty. For the first time, the choices I made truly belonged to me. That night, I sat quietly, reflecting on the day's events. The first victory, the confrontations with the past, the career triumphs, they all converged into a singular realization. Empowerment is built one decision at a time. Each choice, no matter how small, can ripple outward, shaping a life defined not by fear or the judgments of others, but by action, courage, and intentionality. I thought of the waiter one last time, the mysterious card that had sparked the journey, and I understood its purpose. Recognition, belief, and subtle guidance can awaken something dormant in a person, but it is ultimately their own resolve that transforms opportunity into destiny. Tomorrow, new challenges would arise, but I no longer feared them. I had learned that the measure of a man is not how he falls, but how he chooses to rise. And I chose, with full awareness and intent, to rise. This was only the beginning of claiming the life I had always been capable of leading. The morning after the pivotal day felt different, as if the world itself had shifted beneath my feet. The city moved with its usual rhythm, but I walked through it with a quiet certainty that hadn't existed before. The humiliation of Christmas, the laughter of my in-laws, the dissolution of my marriage, all of it still lingered, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had been transmuted into experience, resilience, and a newfound sense of self. I sat at my kitchen table, the card from the waiter now worn at the edges, a talisman of the journey I had undertaken. It reminded me that even the smallest gestures, an acknowledgement, a glance, a subtle sign of belief, can ignite profound change. That spark had carried me through the months of doubt, failure, and tentative victories, guiding me toward reclamation. The work I had taken on, the decisions I had faced, and the choices I had made had led to tangible success. But more than that, they had led to introspection, self-recognition, and empowerment. I had learned that triumph isn't solely external, it's internal. The approval of others, the validation of status or performance, is fleeting. True reclamation comes from acting with integrity, embracing risk, and acknowledging one's own worth. That afternoon, I walked through familiar streets with a lightness that surprised me. The memories of ridicule and despair lingered like shadows, but I no longer recoiled from them. Instead, I carried them as markers of how far I had come, each memory a testament to endurance and growth. The past had shaped me, yes, but it had not imprisoned me. I was free to define the next chapter of my life on my own terms. I found myself reflecting on the relationships I had lost, the marriage that ended, and the family dynamics that had once felt suffocating. There was no anger now, only clarity and acceptance. I understood that their laughter, their judgment, and even their dismissal had been about them, not about me. And in recognizing that, I reclaimed power over my own narrative. In the quiet of the evening, I returned home and allowed myself a moment of stillness. The city lights shimmered outside, a reminder of possibility, of the life that continued beyond the confines of past pain. I felt a deep, unshakable gratitude, not for the hardships themselves, but for the strength and clarity they had forced me to find within myself. I thought of the waiter one final time, imagining his quiet, observant presence somewhere in the world. Without knowing, he had catalyzed the journey that transformed humiliation into empowerment. The card, his subtle recognition, had reminded me of something essential, the value of seeing oneself clearly even when others refused to. As night settled in, I allowed myself to envision a future built on deliberate choices and self-respect. A career that challenged and fulfilled me. Relationships founded on mutual recognition and honesty. A life defined not by fear or judgment, but by intentional action and the courage to pursue what mattered most. I felt a profound sense of reclamation, the culmination of months of internal struggle, external challenges, and quiet victories. The laughter of the past could no longer reach me. It had been replaced by the voice I had cultivated within myself, steady, confident, and unyielding. Finally, I allowed a deep, cleansing breath, the kind that signifies both an ending and a beginning. The journey from humiliation to empowerment had been arduous, but it had delivered me to a place of clarity and strength. I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had chosen to claim. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, I knew with certainty, I was not just surviving, I was reclaiming my life, one conscious, courageous choice at a time. This was the true beginning of everything I was yet to become.